You're listening to Shoe In, covering the ins and outs of all things footwear, from sneakers to heels, loafers to slippers, and every type of shoe in between. Brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. And now your footwear insiders, Matt Priest and Andy Polk.
Hey, Shoe and Show listeners. Welcome back to another exciting episode. This week, we have a special treat for you as we listen in on a conversation that FDRA hosted with Portland State University about our supply chain and crisis. And we all know that the industry is dealing with a ton as it relates to the supply chain, from COVID impact to a glut of imports to Chinese New Year to the ILWU upcoming negotiations with the West Coast ports. And so there's so much going on. We wanted to bring in a group of experts to talk, particularly with the footwear industry and the students at Portland State University. And so we did, and we had Jim Weinberg of Designer Brands. We had Mike Pisa of Apex Global Logistics, Jeff Brubach of the Northwest Seaport Alliance. It was hosted by Daniel Wong, who's a professor at Portland State, along with Jennifer Nolte and Emily Veda of Columbia Sportswear. So there's a lot to unpack here. It's a longer form conversation, but I think you'll find it highly valuable as you consider what's happening to our supply chain. So let's take a listen.
I'm Jennifer Nolte. I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Retail Leadership at Portland State University. And we are really excited to bring you this event today in partnership with the Footwear Distributors Retailers Association. There's obviously a lot of conversation happening today about the supply chain and the movement of goods and products in and out of the US and around the globe. And we felt it really compelling to facilitate a conversation today with a number of industry leaders. We are pleased to be joined by both students and industry in our audience, and we'll have a facilitated conversation and then open it up for Q&A at the end. I really want to thank Matt Priest and FDRA for working with us to organize this event, as well as Emily and Quinn in supporting it and organizing it. And one last note is that we do have a drawing for a product, or a raffle for a product during today's event, thanks to Columbia Sportswear and Emily Veda. You do have to be present to win to the end. So I just want to put that out there so that everyone hopefully will stay for the duration. And thank you again for making the time today. And I want to hand it over to Emily to introduce our panelists. Thanks again.
My name's Emily Veda. I'm Senior Manager of Global Customs and Trade at Columbia Sportswear Company. I'm also the chair of the Athletic and Outdoor Advisory Board at Portland State University. We offer a graduate and undergraduate certificates focused on this industry. We also do a good amount of crossover with supply chain management. Students and professionals can earn a certificate in an industry that they're passionate about while leveraging their degree and experiences. Our courses are informed and taught by industry leaders and provide hands-on learning and it's experiential learning. It's a really exciting program. As somebody who's been in the industry for a long time, I really love that this is a part of the PSU curricula. More recently, we've also added an online business blockchain certificate to help students to understand that industry. And you can visit pdx.edu to learn more about that. We're really excited to be joined today by PSU Professor Daniel Wong, who's the academic director of the the Masters of Science of Global Supply Chain Management. It's a mouthful. He's going to be our moderator today. We're also joined by Jim Weinberg, who is the Chief Merchandising Officer of Designer Brands, Inc., which is the parent company of DSW, which is a name we'll all recognize. Mike Pisa, who's the SVP at Apex Logistics International. And then Jeff Brubach, who's the Business Development Manager of the Northwest Seaport Alliance, which oversees the Seattle and Tacoma ports. So we're joined by a really great panel. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to them to get the discussion started. Thanks for joining.
All right. So thank you, Emily, for such a kind introduction. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be at. So welcome for joining us in Global Supply Chain Crisis. So it's so great to have this all-star panelists here joining us to kick off this conversation. And let's not forget to mention my buddy Quinn O'Rourke. He's here, so he's also going to help co-host things. So in case I left out any questions, he's going to pick that up. So the format we're going to use this morning is I have a set of questions I'd like to go over with each panelist one at a time, right? And then we go a couple rounds of that, and hopefully that will take up about 30 or 40 minutes or so. And after that, Matt is going to come back in. He's going to help facilitate those questions. You're going to be using the online chat box asking questions. Okay, so if that's good, then let's get started. If there are any technical issues, you cannot hear us, you cannot see us, please raise concerns on the chat box. Matt is monitoring that for us. Okay, so if that's good, then let me kick off with asking Jeff first. So Jeff, since you're into this commercial terminal business, what is the problem at all the touch points that we heard so much about? I mean, just a month and a half ago, you turn on the TV, people is going to talk about all the vessels are sitting at the port, somewhere near the ports, outside the port, Long Beach. You got no trucks, you could not get railroad. So what is going on? What's the real picture here?
Well, thanks, Daniel. And thanks to everyone for having us today. Really what we're seeing on the port level is, just like you're saying, a lot of congestion, really from every angle. A lot has been made of all of the vessels at anchor, waiting to get into ports, especially on the West Coast, and numbers growing on the East Coast as well. Just due to really, really high demand from the Far East into the West Coast. And certainly recently we have seen a little bit of improvement. Like we said, the most visible thing are all the vessels waiting at anchor. Still quite a few of those down in Southern California, but the numbers are improving up here. Mostly from ocean carriers with the vessels really off of schedule. They're voided sailings into Seattle-Tacoma, meaning they'll just bypass Seattle-Tacoma on their rotations. And what that has done is cleared up the vessel backlog a little bit. As of this morning, as far as the Port of Tacoma and Port of Seattle are concerned, just 3 vessels at anchor. So numbers there have greatly improved in the Pacific Northwest due to all of the vessel voids and the steamship lines attempting to get back to something resembling a schedule.
So Jeff, let's just one follow on and then I'll move on to Jim. Did the Lunar New Year help? There'll be less traffic coming out 2 weeks ago, right? The Chinese New Year, we call it the Lunar New Year. Did that help or did it make it worse, you think?
We really haven't seen much of a change. Generally, pre-COVID, generally you could expect a little bit of a lull, just like you're saying, around the Lunar New Year. But this year, with everything so out of whack and vessel schedules just not really normal like they have been in previous years, it hasn't really reflected much of a dip or increase for us. It's been pretty steady.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Jeff. Jim. Let me come to you. You're running one of the big brands in this retail space, right? So what are with all this congestion, all this issue that we learned about supply chain problem, what's the impact to your business?
Well, when I think about it and I bubble it up, we've always lived in a world of logistics of using predictability, meaning we know how many days it would take to go from port till we would start to receive things in our facilities. And this has thrown all of that out the window. And so what we've tried to do is say, how do we put some level of predictability into this? Meaning, are we going to add 60-day lead times? Are we going to add 80-day lead times? Like, how many days do we need to add so that we have a predictable supply of goods into our warehousing facilities? So we basically went and added about 100 days. So, that's almost double the amount of time that it was taking before. And what we've seen is even when you try to add that level of predictability to things, it doesn't work because something else happens. We had Omicron come up. We can't get chassis, things I've never even heard of before on the logistics side. And so, I think that's really going back to how I started. It's how do we put some degree of predictability into our supply chain that we used to basically know from port to port how long it was going to take to get things. And it was pretty consistent. And now all through the entire supply chain, whether it's raw materials, whether it's transport, whether it's getting things through our own distribution facilities in the United States, all of it has been upended, and it's trying to figure out what is the right cadence of days to add to it. And the minute, I will tell you, as soon as we think like, okay, we're going to add these 100 days, it's like something else happens. And so that's what it's taught us, to just be nimble in the face of unpredictability.
So when you talk about that nimbleness, is it mostly those actions taken by your company, or you're actually working even closer with your supplier or your partners in Asia? What's the relationship
closer
like?
With the suppliers, because every supplier tends to have different issues. So it's having, a couple things, having the merchants work with the suppliers just to understand what are the issues, but it's also having our company's logistics areas in DSW work with the suppliers' individual logistics areas, because two heads against this are better than one. So as an example, I was dealing with a vendor. We have a new launch that's happening in May, and they were trying to figure it all out on their own, meaning the domestic company. And I was like, that's not going to work. It's becoming so unwieldy. You need to marry yourselves with our logistics department to try to come up with solutions. We never did that before. Basically, in the past, which, the past is it's the past. We wrote the order. We said we wanted it delivered in this window, and you delivered in that window, and that was the end of that. And the world kind of went along. All of that is upended now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll come back to that later about Vietnam. So I'll come back to that. So Mike, let me move on to you. So you being the SVP running this 3PL Apex, that's your world, right? You're there to provide a solution to your customers. But yet we hear from Jim, we hear from Jeff. They're all part of your customer base, right? One is an enabler, one is your customer like. So how do you help them? Whereas to me, it seems like all the tools being taken away from us.
That's fair enough, Daniel. 3PLs have always had an important role in the supply chain. I mean, our position is to provide flexible solutions to customers. We're unique in the sense that that as a 3PL, you have contracts with all the ocean carriers, many truckers, many warehouse providers, and we can kind of shift around as necessary. So 3PLs through COVID became a very important partner to a lot of the importers in the country. It's when you talk about the bottlenecks that are going on, there's bottlenecks everywhere, right? There was bottlenecks at origin, there's bottlenecks at destination. So we're looking at any given time, and I'll take a couple of examples. COVID, caused a lot of issues at different origins at different times through the last 2 years. And one of the recent challenges was the Antien port had a COVID outbreak. So there was no sailings coming out at the Antien for a while. And as a 3PL, we don't want to sit and just sit and wait. So we had to come up with creative solutions. We started trucking cargo all over, trucking stuff to Shanghai or a smaller port in Nansha, just to be able to keep cargo flowing. And, I think, being able to provide those flexible solutions is really, been a benefit to the customers. It's not easy, Daniel, right? Because once somebody figures out a solution that works, then everybody else tries to do that solution as well. So I think from our standpoint, we're always trying to forward think, what could happen and what's going to be our solution when that does happen. And you can talk about a lot of different issues. I mean, you just touched on Vietnam. We were doing some very creative things out of Vietnam that I never thought we would do, right? We were trucking things, different locations, railing them, different locations, just to get them on a vessel to be able to leave those particular ports of origin. So I think, the 3PL, that's their value to the importer or exporter, is being able to help them navigate, like Jim was starting to touch on, come up with creative solutions to kind of deal with any challenge that might arise at a given time. So,
okay, great. Thank you for that. So Jeff, let me come back to you. So that now that we, for the folks that still not believing that we have a problem, yes, we do have a problem. Global logistics, right? We have a problem. Global supply chain, we have a problem. So sitting from where you're at, what are the things that you're looking at? How do you know the problems are getting better or getting worse? I mean, are you relying on a set of KPI, and what does that KPI look like?
From a port's perspective, that's a good question, Daniel. From a port perspective, we are generally taking a look at this through the lens of terminal capacity. or berth capacity, right? Vessels at anchor indicates a lack of berth capacity. We don't have enough room for vessels, things like that. And then terminal capacity. We're very close with our terminal operators, speak to them on a daily basis, working with them on these challenging issues. And yeah, I would say primarily terminal capacity. When imports are coming in and aren't immediately available for pickup, things like that, different space management tools that our terminals are using to get around these congestion issues. That is primarily where we notice the challenge, because of course right now we're leasing additional space to our terminal operators and creating off-dock support yards and things like that. So the space crunch, I would say, is the primary indicator to us.
Okay, great, thank you. Mm-hmm. All right, so Jim, back to you. What's your out of stock situation like during this past holidays? Do you have a lot of, so let's say you normally carry 10,000 SKUs. What percentage of that were available and what percentage of that were out of stock?
So the actual issue really happened in the third quarter. We caught back up in the fourth quarter. And that happened because, like I said, we were adding days in, and it actually got worse as we approach the month of August and September. Our in-stocks now are pretty high. They're actually higher than they were even 3 years ago. Because again, going back to what I was saying before, trying to put some level of predictability to this, we've added so many days to our key items that we want to stay in stock in, because that's the number one thing that revolves around our customer promise. Like when he or she comes into our door, they want what they want, and they want us to stay in stock. So like I said earlier, before we could predict how that needed to flow in. And obviously we were never perfect. And now we've just added a buffer to make sure we can stay in stock. So caught short in third quarter, caught back up in fourth quarter, and feel pretty good about where we are right now.
Right. So right now, Jim, you're feeling good being the chief merchandising officer. That's before your board meeting, right? So your board meeting is coming up. So I'm anticipating this conversation. I used to sit there, right? It's like your CFO and your board member is going to ask you, Jim, what on heck are you spending all these extra inventory dollars? So how are you going to justify the JIT versus a JIC? That's what it sounds like to me, is that you're using a JIC to get over the hump, right? 100 days, more products, key products into your pipeline, holding them longer or whatever the case may be. Those are all money. So how are you going to...
It's not necessarily holding the inventory longer. It's adding days into the flow of those products from China. Because if you think about it, there's longer dwell times in the ports of China. It's taking longer to go from the factory to the port. Just like you were saying earlier, once it gets here, it's taking longer to get through the facilities. Once we get possession of the product, it's pretty predictable how long it takes to go through our facilities into our stores. So it's not adding inventory necessarily into our inventory position. It's that we're staying in stock by adding these days into the supply chain. And it's because we were not predicting properly before, because there was so much unknown. That's what caused a higher level of out of stocks in the third quarter. Again, equalized itself in the fourth quarter, and we feel pretty good about where we are right now.
Okay, great. And I'll come back later. So Jim, I want you to think about your data science people, right? Because Jennifer is also in charge of the blockchain, and Emily talks about. So I want to see if your company is thinking about using more advanced AI or blockchain to help improve your forecasting. So we'll come back to that. Okay. So let me go to Mike. So now that we are heading into 2022, right? Beginning, February is almost the end, spring is almost here. So if you have a new set of clients coming to you asking for help, what would you advise them? What do they need to be thinking about? Where are they going to put their money? Can you shed some light about what are the big things you're going to talk about?
Sure. I think now that we're heading into 22, we've been dealing with this issue for 2 years, really, right? 20 and 21, and we've kind of settled into like this is our new reality. And I think companies have also settled into that too. So what we're starting to see is, we want to encourage flexibility. Don't just operate in one trade lane. For example, if you're sourcing a product and or products from one given origin and moving everything to the West Coast. We want to encourage flexibility, possibly establishing other positions in the country, East Coast position for warehousing, and also sourcing. We saw some companies really get hurt. If they were sourcing, if their main product was sourced in one origin but didn't have a backup vendor or backup location in another origin, that those companies really suffered. Like, for example, when Vietnam was down for almost a month, right? If you were sourcing that product from there, you really had nowhere else to go. So now companies are thinking about sourcing diversification. Jim's talked a lot about here is just adding time to your supply chain, to your inventory, because we saw a lot of companies really not building enough time, and different things can happen at different times, so you need to be prepared for that. And then there was the cost issue that we haven't really touched on here yet, but now I think we're settling in that this is the cost. I mean, we're into a reality here. It didn't go away all of last year. It doesn't look like the cost is receding that much for this year, and probably longer than that. So I think companies are also settling into how to price their products. Let's build in this cost into our sale price and things like that. So I think everyone's starting to understand the new normal and adjusting accordingly. But flexibility and adjusting your pricing, I think, is key. And those are kind of the main issues that we're talking about right now.
So So my follow on, do you see your clients having to raise their price if it's MSRP to cover the cost? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it varies per product, per commodity. But I think people can no longer absorb those costs that we've seen in the past. So I think people tried to absorb them for the first year, or more. But as we head into 22, I think it's become a reality that it can't be absorbed. It has to be passed on. And one point I just like to make is, forecasting and planning is really key in this environment. And some companies weren't necessarily great with their forecasting and planning. And now it's just a top priority. If you can kind of forecast, plan, make bookings far in advance, you're at a great advantage. And if you have vendors that can kind of meet their ex-factory dates and that line up to your forecasting, there's a real advantage when it comes to shipping in that environment. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mike. So Jeff, one more question, and then I go to Jim and go to Mike, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. So Jim, Jeff, from where you at, is labor crunch, are you seeing the labor crunch impacting your business? And we hear so much about labor crunch. Do you see any of that happening up at where you at?
We would look at it through the port lens at primarily ILWU labor, right? Staffing our terminal gates, yards, and vessels, and things like that. We really haven't seen too much disruption on that side. I mentioned earlier vessels being off schedule. A lot of times, in rare circumstances, that can force a lot of vessels onto maybe 1 or 2 days of the week for us, which does put a strain on the locals, Local 23 in Tacoma and Local 19 in Seattle. But outside of circumstances like that, we haven't seen too much as far as labor shortage. Some periodic, COVID issues here and there. But the ILWs have done a great job of staffing the vessels up here in Seattle, Tacoma during this. But we do hear, of course, and other people have talked, we do hear about labor and other capacities being short, right? Whether it's truck driver availability, warehouse labor, things like that. And when those shortages happen, that prevents people from picking up imports from our terminals, thus creating congestion for us. So I would say that's really the angle that labor shortages in general have impacted the port.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Jeff.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Jim, coming back to you. So not being able to predict. So how you plan to solve that? Is your company, are you start talking to your CIO and your data science group thinking about using some of those more advanced tool, AI or blockchain, so on? Or can you shed some light on how you're planning to deal with that in 2022?
Yeah, I think, we've always used advanced analytics to try to figure out what is the proper flow and timing of our inventory. So it's just building a different data set. So I think someone else touched on this. It's not the same throughout the world. So, goods coming out of Latin America have less volatility than goods coming out of China. You mentioned, the issues that happened in Vietnam as we went into the winter. So it's just trying to be flexible too, and how you move things through the supply chain. Before COVID, we used to, make certain products in certain hemispheres, and now we've opened all of that up. But it is using advanced analytics of how we position inventory. We are extremely flexible of where goods are offloaded. There are ports that we're using that I've lived in California for a long time. I didn't even know there were ports there, to tell you the truth. Like there's a port in Ventura, apparently, that goods are being offloaded in. I'm like, there is? I have no idea where it is. And they explained to me, not that I'm in the middle of this, where it was. And I'm like, oh, I guess that is a port. So it's really, I think, it used to be that the logistics departments in our vendors, as well as internally, worked independently from the merchants and the finance teams. And it really is now everyone working together, because at the end of the day, the customer doesn't care about any of this. They want what they want. They want it at the price they want. There is inflation, like you talked about, but this is all on us to figure out how to get them the products that they want. And they're not interested in everyone's excuse. So it's up to us to use advanced analytics to get them the products that they want and put them in the right positioning throughout the country so their desires are met.
Yeah. So Jim, I hear that you mentioning a little bit about shifting your sourcing strategy to help managing the unpredictability, right? So if I interpret it this way, saying we know most companies import their sports apparel products from Asia, right? Whether it's China, Vietnam, Indonesia, and so on. If you want to start allocating some of that volume to other parts of the world, there's two questions. One is, are your tier one suppliers ready to support you on that? It's not so easy just to take the footprint you have in Vietnam and move it to, let's say, Brazil or Mexico, right? So that's one. The second piece is the sourcing material, the raw material itself. The supply chain is really built around China. So how are you going to take that and move it into another part of the world? So,
it depends on Sure, it depends on the product. So the first part of your question is like, how do we work with our domestic vendors to get what we need? To be honest, we don't really interface with them of where products are being made. So that's more on them. But, we have been very public about what we call taking our destiny into our own hands. And that means making more products through the Commuto group that we acquired a few years ago. And in there, we are moving products to different hemispheres, to your point, where they have access to raw materials. So India can make certain types of products. We weren't making things there before. Right before I came in here, I was talking with our men's design merchants, and we are moving some products to Latin America, where they have access to leather. So I think it really is taking into account the raw materials. You're right. A lot of the supply chain was based around Asia, and some of those products can't be moved. But where they can be moved, so that you're minimizing your risk, we are doing that internally. And I think it also helps for us to think differently about sometimes it's not just about the first cost; it's about adding this level of predictability to things too. That if the number one thing you're always trying to solve to is what does the customer want. Then sometimes they just want the shoe to be in stock. And if that means that it's going to be slightly more, but the quality of it's better, they're willing to go on that journey.
Great. Thank you much. All right. So Mike, you get to answer the last question, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. Okay. So Mike, from you having working with all the big companies, clients of yours, what is the skill set that you think they're missing? What are this company needing? If they're going to add more talents in 2022, where would you suggest that they add? Is it more in supply chain, more in logistics, more in AI? Where is that?
I think that's a great question, Daniel. So I think the logistics and supply chain has become a very desirable, field. And I think companies are really looking at it for solutions. They want forward-thinking, solution-oriented people, and I think it through this crisis really put us in the spotlight There's a couple of issues that I'd like to highlight here. I think through the process, partnerships have become very key. Who you partner with, what service providers you partner with. I'll give you the example that over the years, some companies, haven't treated myself or other 3PLs that well, right? And when then all of a sudden, a lot of people started calling over the last 2 years and saying, I need help, and you're more apt to help the person that's been good to you over time and been a true partner. So I think you're seeing kind of a resurgence of partnerships between the shippers and the service providers, 3PLs, which is refreshing, and we're all in this together, so we got to get through it together. And then when it comes to like what personnel, like logistics 3PL, I think the companies that we've seen navigate this the best are the ones that attack the issues. We have a lot of shippers that ship into the middle part of the country, Chicago, Memphis, Indianapolis, and we didn't talk too much today about the rail issues, but there's been a fair amount of rail congestion going into the Midwest, and we weren't able to move cargo as seamlessly through various ports into the Midwest. So we had to, some companies made decisions very early on to transload containers off the West Coast. And we ended up transloading just under 20,000 containers off the West Coast, which I never thought we would do, right? Wasn't a cheap solution, but it still got the products into Columbus, still got them into Chicago, Indianapolis, and Memphis. But those are the companies that attacked the problem. They said, okay, if we can't get it into the country by rail, we're going to attack it and we're going to truck it over there. And then the other thing is, with those logistics and supply chain team members that every company has, think of the worst case scenario, and then, that's going to happen, and then you have to plan for it, right? And I see there's some questions in the chat box about the port strike that's coming up here, or the possible port strike with the labor negotiations on the West Coast. And listen, last year we made a decision that we were going to plan that's going to happen, right? So we've already added a lot of aircrafts into our mix. We've added charter vessels into our mix because we've already planned that this. Listen, at this point, anything that can go wrong is going to go wrong. So let's just plan for it. And I think having that mindset, then if something goes right that you weren't expecting, it becomes a little bit easier to deal with. And the last part, Daniel, is I think you got to have multiple solutions, or multiple service providers everywhere, because I'll be the first one to tell you that every 3PL is a little bit different, right? So I would encourage companies that we used to do everything for, now they might have 3 or 4 or 5 providers, because there might be some weeks I can do everything, but there's going to be a lot of time where I can't do everything. So having that diversification with service providers, I think, is key, and helps people navigate these challenges. So yeah.
Okay. All right, great. So last question for you, Mike. I lied. I got one more. With the fuel price rising this fast, right? We are $100 a barrel now, close to it. Do you anticipate that it's going to cascade down to your shipper?
Daniel, I used to be really good at predicting the market. I've given up on that as of the moment, but obviously fuel is a big contributor to logistics cost, internationally, domestically, all different challenges. And I'm not necessarily sure what's going to continue to happen with the fuel cost, but it's definitely impacting where the pricing is today. And, we see it impacting for at least, the next 2 quarters of this year, because we anticipate some rise here for a little while.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. All right, Matt, if you could come back up and help us facilitate the rest of the questions from online, that'd be great. So Matt, it's all yours.
Yeah. Hey, can you hear me and see me? All right. So, Mike, you teed up our first question really well, and that's going to go to Jeff. So way to put Jeff on the spot. And that is the ILWU negotiations, Jeff. We got 3 or 4 questions around that. And that's a big concern, to be honest with you. We've been talking about it with our members pretty regularly these past few weeks as our folks are putting product on the water here very soon, with the timetable of it landing sometime in that June, July timeframe, and the ILWU contract up June 30. If we wind the clocks back to easier times, April of 2015, when we had the the West Coast port slowdown at that time, that was child's play compared to what we've seen since, right? And our question for you, or the question many are asking, is kind of how's that negotiation going to play out? For what we understand, we probably won't know much until about June. And then maybe the contract will expire and they'll be hopefully operating even, which is normal, operating without a contract as they negotiate. But to tee it up for you, we've got a labor-friendly president in the White House. We've got a supply chain in chaos, which is the premise of this discussion. And we have an emboldened ILWU, and no one's blaming them. They have a lot of leverage, and a concern about automation that's continued, the continued development of automation at our ports. So that's the lay of the land. Walk us through how we should be feeling about June 30, 2022.
Yeah, this is a great question, obviously, and a great time to be chatting about it. So as the Port Authority, we are not direct PMA members. So I don't have any, type of insider info here by any means. But obviously, we are very close with the ILWU and very close with the steamship lines and the terminal operators who make up those bargaining parties there. We do know that they are chatting. Like you said, June 30th is the date where the current contract expires. I don't have any indications that there are going to be any sort of labor disruptions at all. Obviously, you alluded to this is sort of a situation where we are going to be waiting until closer to that deadline there in June. And like in previous contract negotiations, if it isn't decided by the end of June, they generally will keep operating. But no, I don't have anything that implies that there will be an imminent disruption at all. Like you said, yes, of course, automation. There's been some things in the press about that. Will be a major touch point there. Driven primarily by the Southern California terminals who are implementing a lot of these the newer technology that we haven't quite got into in Seattle and Tacoma yet. But obviously those are implications for down the lines for other West Coast ports as well. Cautiously optimistic. Mike was alluding to, if it's your supply chain at stake, maybe preparing for, what could be the worst case scenario. But like I said, I don't have any indicators that is going to happen here. And so we're just kind of waiting to see, staying close to the folks that we chat with. But yeah, like I said, no indication that there'll be any major disruption, but we will see.
Well, we appreciate that, Jeff. Counterpoint between Jeff and Mike on that one, which we'll take. The president's envoy, his supply chain czar, Portnoy, is stepping down as under the new transportation bill that moved a more permanent role takes hold, I think over in DOT, if I'm not mistaken. So we'll keep an eye on what the White House does as we kind of head towards that imminent negotiation in the middle of the summer. We have a question based on the current situation from capacity, commodity price increases, inflation, COVID-19. When does anyone expect to see improvement in supply chain? In which quarter in 2023? Mike, I'll pose that to you first because you said you're not good at predictions anymore. So we'll test that. We'll test that notion. And then if anyone else wants to jump in, you can provide your prediction as well.
Sure. So I think Matt. From a company standpoint, we think the recovery is going to take some time, and there's a couple of reasons we feel that way. We still got a fair amount of backlog coming off the West Coast. We've still got companies are running at very low inventory levels. So we've also seen inventory levels really dwindle. So we think companies are going to look to build back some of those inventory levels around the country. It really depends on commodity as it relates to that. Where companies sit with their overall inventory levels. And then the other thing that we see is we've seen a lot of companies not ship, which, has been interesting. We've seen certain commodities, let's call it, furniture or tires or things that can't necessarily tolerate these high rates that are seeing on the logistics side. And, you start to see companies like kind of rate their products, A, B, C, and D, and maybe only ship A and B and kind of hold back in C and D until the rate levels fall a little bit. So we think that it's going to take some time to recover. We've heard different predictions from some of our larger importers, but at this point, we're looking towards like Q1 or Q2 of 24. I mean, we think we've got another year or two of this, and there's a lot of reasons that we feel that way that we can kind of dive into. I think, one of it is the demand capacity issue is just so out of balance right now. And there's a lot of factors that come into play there too, like economies, Every country has a different economy. So everybody's economy is kind of at a different level of COVID recovery, let's call it. And, so we think it's going to be a while. And we also think the ocean carriers have enjoyed this profitability. So there's going to be no rush to kind of return back to normalcy, let's call it. They kind of like the commotion and the rate levels. So we think it might stay for a while.
Got it. We have so many questions coming in and they're great. So I'm just going to keep rolling. And if you really do want to jump in on one that I don't pose to you, please let me know. But Jim, I have a question that's come in. What signs from your perspective, a retailer perspective, what signs will we see that the supply chain is starting to normalize, and how will purchasing lead times be adjusted to avoid inventory exposure?
I keep asking myself the same question because I keep thinking this will get better. And then at some point, we're going to have the opposite problem, that because we built all this time in, that things will get better. I guess when that actually happens, Matt, that's when I'll see that it's normalizing, because we keep believing that we've got this under control in terms of how many days we're having to add, and then something else happens. And I think, what I share with the teams at DSW is that's what we've learned, that we just moved from one, I call it speed bumps. We moved from one speed bump to the other. Was China, now it's Vietnam, then something else happens, then containers are falling off ships, like things you never dreamt of are happening. And so when we're able to start seeing any of this improve in terms of the predictable part, but as well as the cost part, I think like they were saying, yeah, there are sometimes buying containers on the spot market, like it does drop for like a week or two, but then it goes back up. So I agree. What I was laughing at to myself was, it seems like when we start a year or we start a quarter, people are like, I think it will get better in not in 9 months, because that seems like it's so far away. Like people will say that, and then it never does. So I do agree. I think it's going to be not in this year and well into 2023, as you get closer to the election, that we see some sign of normalcy, but something else could happen too. And then we've just learned to live in an environment that we have to think very differently than we ever thought before.
Yeah, that's the right word. Perseverance comes to mind as you were talking, Jim, and I think that's absolutely right. A number of questions have come to you about nearshoring and sourcing. You mentioned that you kind of, the vendors deal with that, or the Commuto side of your business deals with that. I'll be happy to answer that on behalf of the industry. We represent 95% of the industry. And Daniel mentioned 95% of our imports come from China, Vietnam, and Indonesia in that regard. Sourcing is being kind of turned upside down right now, particularly as President Trump came into office and added additional $1 billion in duties on our products coming in. That was about a 25% increase in the amount of duties that we pay annually. And so our members have been looking for ways to diversify, because we've been so heavy in China. At one point in our history, we were about 90% of our volume was from China. And so if we're looking to diversify, there's clearly movement into Vietnam. There's clearly spillover into Cambodia and Bangladesh and Indonesia. But there are some of our members that are checking back in with Brazil, checking back in with Mexico. Not huge volumes when you think about the 2.5 billion pairs that we import in every year, which is about 7.2 pairs for every single person in this country every single year. And so it's all these one-off kind of explorations for diversification. And it will continue to be predominantly Asia. There's not a huge play for the mass retail, family retail space to move that kind of production volume to these other countries. It just doesn't exist. And so you'll continue to see some of that market share shed off of China and head elsewhere, but and not in huge kind of massive ways. And so that's the answer on the sourcing thing. We have a sourcing event next month. I'll be happy to provide anyone information about a deeper dive into that going forward. Let's see, moving through, Jeff, with the port congestion, obviously one visual challenge is the ships in anchorage. And this may not be as big of a challenge for you all, but you can answer on behalf of your West Coast port brethren, if you will. This question is curious what the true bottleneck is. Is it the unloading process, yard space challenges, or getting enough trucks through to move containers out, or something else? You talked about this with the KPI and the space, but maybe you want to take one last stab at this.
Yeah, this is a good question. So the true driver really, lack of terminal space. If we're talking about port congestion specifically, lack of terminal space. All this increased in demand brought a lot of imports into our terminals. And then with everything being a little bit out of whack on the vessel schedule side, we have a little bit of an empty surplus of empty containers as well. So a lot of these terminals are very full with empties waiting to get back to Asia, because as we discussed at the top of the call, ocean carriers voiding or skipping certain ports in their schedules. What that has done is allowed our terminals to dig out of the imports a little bit better, but it provides less opportunity to evacuate those empties back to Asia. So our terminals are sitting on a high number of empties, high number of imports, and moving the trucks through to distribute that, whether it's like Mike was talking about, to get transloaded locally and then sent out via domestic rail, or whether that's intact inland rail, getting the containers, in creating an environment of true throughput environment at our terminals. I think that's what we're striving for, and I would say, the glut of imports and empties is what's causing the congestion at the port side.
Yeah. And I even talking anecdotally, some of our members, a lot of people are just shipping now, right? With the expectation, back to the ILWU point, of a slowdown in the summer, right at peak time, when trying to get in for holiday and all this stuff. So the supply chain is like this cord that's been like, it's been shaken, it's reverberating, and the peaks and valleys are just in different spots than we're used to from a design cycle and an importation cycle. And so it's so difficult to know when peak season will be, because it's shifting at all moments. Mike, a couple questions for you. First and foremost, you talked about partnerships. Are the partnerships that you talked about exclusive, or is it common for a shipper to have multiple partnerships throughout the industry? And then I want to add on the next question for you. What extent has the trucking issue in Canada affected logistics within the U.S.?
Sure. So the first question, we used to be a little selfish. We didn't want to share business with other, providers, let's call it. But we want our shippers to be successful. And because of all the capacity constraints, I'll give the example that, some weeks I have excess capacity, so I'm looking for cargo. And then other times I am completely full. It's very difficult for me to get a booking. And so we've, as of the beginning of last year, we encouraged our customers to have multiple providers per trade lane, because we think that's the most successful recipe for success in the current environment. The situation could be vice versa too. We're seeing people that used to sole source or partner with one provider now have 5, 6, 7 providers. And the other thing I'll say, Matt, is nobody is immune to this. There's customers that we're working with that are in the top 5 retailers in the country, that never once used a 3PL before for their international logistics, now have 4, 5, or 6 3PLs in the mix. So it just gives you an indication that nobody's immune to it. Everyone's kind of fighting the same challenges, whether it's a big provider, big retailer, or small to medium-sized shipper. So we definitely encourage multiple providers. The Canada situation regarding the trucking is very interesting. We've seen some challenges in Canada throughout the year through the Port of Vancouver. The trucking issue is definitely causing some disruptions. I can't, my focus is really on the international logistics side, so I can't really comment too much on where I think that's headed, but I would say that it's definitely disrupting cargo flow, whether it's through the West Coast of Vancouver, and then we have a lot of cargo that comes from New York up into Toronto, and there's definitely a lot of disruption, caused by this, and delays, and people are holding cargo in the U.S. To try and kind of avoid that situation currently.
Yeah, I hear you. A lot of cross-border transit that's being impacted for sure. Jim, let me ask you this. A lot of this discussion has been centered around our reaction to the challenges that we continue to face today, which is critical and has been a great conversation. Thank you for that feedback, Stephen. As we alter our current tactics and strategies, it is important to also consider how we prevent this same situation from happening again. What sort of forward-looking long-term changes in strategy are you considering?
So I think you touched on it, Matt, earlier, the diversification of the supply chain. So you're not going to replace China, but if you have movement of things in Latin America, in other countries within Asia. You touched on Vietnam, Indo, Cambodia. Those are things that we were never considering before. We give it lip service, like we're going to do some things in Mexico, but we never really did. So having a permanent solution, having offices opened up in some of these hemispheres again, those are definite actions that we are taking. It's also how can we then work with the supply chain on the raw material side differently than we used to. So before we would contract, this is on our businesses that we own and control, we would contact with factories to make certain things, and it was sort of up to them to worry about the raw material piece. We're now in that discussion with them so that we really are operating as a partnership. And then I would say the last piece is, on the logistics side, we're really open to different ways of moving merchandise than we've ever looked at before. So like I mentioned, there's, just in case anyone's interested, there is a port in Ventura, like bringing things into other parts of the country. We are airing things that we would never have considered airing before, even though that's, really expensive. Instead of sending things by rail, we're now sending things on team trucks. So it's just really having a portfolio of solutions instead of being so rigid that this is how we move freight, how we make goods. I think it's really that, Matt, and having a solution-oriented mindset that I think someone touched on this earlier, that, don't just come to me with all the problems. What are the solutions? What are solution-based thinking? And that's very different in this world before. So, internally in the company, this was the logistics problem. You go figure it out. And now it's really thinking about it holistically throughout the whole organization, the whole supply chain of how do we get the customers the products that they want when they want it. It's not going to just take one organization. It takes the whole company rowing in the same direction to get that done.
Yeah, that's well said. Well said, Jim. We got a couple questions on advocacy that I'll handle real quickly as the shoe lobbyist in the room. Is there any exciting legislation, lobbying efforts happening to evolve the way we import efficiently? Great question. We always seem to be behind the eight ball from U.S. government perspective on innovation, where the ports actually are leading in this regard and are funding it at the state level. But we recently passed a traditional infrastructure bill that passed in a bipartisan way that's going to funnel billions and billions of dollars into a lot of different supply chain issues at the ports and elsewhere. That will take time, clearly. And it's hard to see that. You're not going to see the results of that anytime soon because it just takes time for those outflows to come into infrastructure and for those jobs to be bid on and all that goes into building that up. But in the long term, we're hopeful. There's also the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, which has passed the House almost unanimously, is designed to create more visibility and line of sight into contracting, demurrage charges, other things that have been frustrating importers and companies during COVID. And the U.S. Senate is supposed to move their version of it very soon with the hopes that President Biden will sign it. And so that'll be another kind of it'll change the landscape for our engagement with the carriers themselves as it relates to line of sight, transparency, and empowering the Federal Maritime Commission to be more kind of aggressive in defending importers who are subject to some crazy fees, where a terminal operator will hold on to a container and an importer will go up and say, "We're ready to take it on now." And the terminal operator is like, "Well, you don't have access to it, but because we're keeping it, we're still going to charge you to hold it, even though you want to take it now, but we're not going to let you take it." So there's just a lot of shenanigans going on right now, which is frustrating our companies for sure. We also have a quick question on the New York State Fashion Sustainability and Social Accountability Act, which is a supply chain mapping and on the environment and other impacts that happen. It's pretty broad and extensive and pie in the sky, I think, from the NGO perspective. And so the question is, do we think this act will be adopted by more states in 2022? It hasn't yet been adopted by New York yet. And so we are engaging with the state as we speak to help craft a response as to how we think industry is already doing a lot of what's being asked without being forced into some kind of regulatory environment where, as we've seen on product safety, is really difficult to navigate from a state by state perspective. But we have a one pager on that questioner if you want to send me an email. I'll be happy to share that with you. A couple questions for you, Mike. We only have a few more minutes. We're not going to be able to get to all of these. I apologize, but we've had some really good questions. Mike, just a few questions for you. Are you now taking on new customers and shippers? Several months ago, this person said it was hard to get any forwarders to take on new customers.
That's true, Matt. We took a position. We did onboard some strategic customers last year. We took a position that we wanted to make sure our existing business was taken care of. We have a limited amount of capacity as a company as well. Although our position in the market is one of the largest capacity holders, we want to be able to flex up to meet our existing customer needs. The timing of this question is pretty good because we're in the middle of contract season with the ocean carriers currently. So if there's ever going to be a time to onboard any customers or new business, the landscape of what those contracts are going to look like, and it's going to be a lot different than what we've seen in years past, but there is opportunity to onboard new customers, I would say, between now and May. And then that window kind of closes down, not completely, but it limits itself a little bit, just so we can make sure we can meet the needs of existing customers.
Got it. I'll ask one last question. Daniel, we talked about this in the green room, but it came, so we'll ask it. This person's wondering if the conflict in Ukraine is going to increase the ocean freight higher. Any thought? I'll just throw that out there. I don't want to put anyone on the spot. Any thoughts on what potential conflict? We don't want to take light of it, but any conflict with Russia invading Ukraine, what that will do to the inflationary pressure we're already seeing on just about everything in the supply chain.
Matt, I'll make a comment on that real quick because we've looked at that pretty closely. We think it's going to could have a significant impact on the air market. Some of the larger, cargo airlines are Russian-based or Eastern European-based that could disrupt some of that traffic. We're not seeing a huge impact on the ocean cargo, so I'll just leave it like that for now.
Got it. Any other before I turn it over to Daniel? Any other closing thoughts from any of our panelists on things you wanted to say that I didn't ask you about? No. Well, Daniel, it seems like we're closing in on the top of the hour, so wanted to turn it back over to you. We do have a winner in our raffle, so I want to announce that, but I don't want to preclude you from having the last word on your end.
No, I want to thank you, Matt, being the presidente. Right, Presidente of your
El Presidente. I prefer El Presidente.
And all the panelists giving us the time because this is really informative. It's really critical that we continue to have this type of conversation, and having those conversations really help practitioner. Right? I mean, I'm sure on the call is like right now is at 89. There was 96, 97. There are folks, from the fact that Portland State here, right, located in the backyard of Nike, Adidas, Columbia Sports, and all these great companies. So oftentimes they only get part of the story, right? So now actually talking to the folks that in the industry at the senior level really give us a better feel for what is actually going on. So we'd love to have another opportunity, maybe couple quarters out, maybe in September, that can come back and kind of share a little bit more, see if we're going to have a same kind of Christmas like what we did, or is it going to be a better one, right? So that's what my hope. So.
Got it. Well, I appreciate that, Daniel. And thank you for being our moderator. I want to announce our winner of our Columbia Sportswear raffle. And one of the cool things about this event is that there are a lot of students in the room, which is unusual for an FDRA event. So we thank all the students for joining. I probably would have been playing video games or at the NC State basketball game in my college years and not at one of these things. But that being said, we want to congratulate Darcy Stevens, who is still with us, who is the winner of our random selection of the Columbia Sportswear raffle. Darcy, shoot me an email, mpriest, mpriest @fdra.org, and we'll make sure you get hooked up with an item of your choice from Columbia Sportswear. So thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. To our panelists, thank you so much for spending time kind of breaking this down. We've had a number of great feedback in the chat box, people asking us to do this more often, so we'll look to do that. For FDRA members, we do this just about every week on our Tuesday member call, 2 p.m. Eastern. So if you're not a member of FDRA, shoot me an email. We'll make that happen because we talk with the ports every Tuesday. We talk about the shoe economy. We talk about e-commerce and brick and mortar and and supply chain and sourcing. So we do this regularly. If you're a student and you want to listen in from time to time, we're happy to have you join us as well. So unless there's anything else anyone wants to say, we'll close it out and wish everyone a great rest of your day. So thanks so much for coming.
Shoe In has been brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. For information about FDRA, visit fdra.org.